I struggle with understanding whether or not this is going to be valuable, but it's on my mind and maybe I'll leave it up. We'll see. Really, truly, this time of the year bothers me for other people because there are so many people who have this so wrong. And it pains me to be able to help them and want to help them, but they don't want to be helped. And so that's something I just have to come to terms with. But that doesn't mean that I won't try. So fundamentally, this is the time of the year that a lot of people look forward to on account of what they believe are 3 unfulfilled fall feasts. And that couldn't be further from the truth. They are fulfilled. They're not fulfilled. There's nothing in the Bible that states that Jesus fulfilled them. They were part of the Old Testament law. He wasn't of the proper tribe to be a priest and to fulfill those things. He didn't fulfill them. The feasts pointed to the person of Christ. This is being versus doing. And I do believe that the church is stuck in this obedience/action orientation mindset. That they have to be watching, that's a doing. That they have to be ready, that's, and by virtue of being ready, that means watching. So it's not a being, it's a doing. They think that they have to be obedient, that there's levels of acceptability to God. The church just has a lot of things wrong. And because they have this doing mindset, this obedience mindset, they believe that the unfulfilled feasts are doing, that they are action oriented, like attributing the Feast of Trumpets to Jesus returning to get the church. That's an activity that Jesus would perform. That perhaps the Day of Atonement. And there are various different things that people say about this. Is one of the reasons that you know it's wrong is because there's no singular conclusion that this group has. It's tossing different ideas around about how it might be. So that's your first indication that it's not right, is if there isn't a consensus about this. But regardless. And then the Day of Atonement would say factor into the start of the 70th week or to the end of the 70th week with the second coming of Christ. And the tabernacles relates to the kingdom. So you would have Jesus physically returning to do something to get the church, and then Jesus physically returning to do something else at the second coming, and then Jesus physically establishing a kingdom on earth. So the attribution that this group makes to what they believe are the 3 outstanding feasts to be fulfilled are action orientation. And yet that is counter to what the Bible tells us was the point of the feasts. They were not doing. They were to point to the person of Christ, who he is. Being. They were pointing to the being of Christ, not to anything that he specifically would do, but literally to his person. And this is a big distinction. Somebody commented earlier and said that they think that I'm making essentially a mountain out of a molehill or creating something to talk about that doesn't exist. But truly at its core, I believe this is the fundamental error behind this line of thought is because people attribute what should be being to doing when it has nothing to do with that at all. Jesus was born under the law to redeem people from the curse of it. Necessarily that means that the old covenant was in place when he was born. And just like, so let's look at prophecy as pattern, okay? You always have in the patterns that I'm going to give you, you always have old covenant activity, new covenant activity, and something in the middle. So Daniel 70th week, 6 purposes. You would expect 3 on one side, 3 on the other, with some kind of divider in between. And that is in fact what you find. To finish the transgression, to make an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity relate to the old covenant. And then the cross, which actually shut up or facilitated the ending of the old covenant, under which Jesus declared, "It is finished," which is to finish the transgression, bowed his head and gave up the ghost, declared the old covenant done and all sins under it paid for. And then because it was shut up, it could never be transgressed again. Hence the make an end of sins and make reconciliation for iniquity, because that same death on the cross provided reconciliation from man to God. So the cross is the dividing point. And then afterward, under new covenant, there will be to bring an everlasting righteousness kingdom, to seal up the vision and prophecies, forward looking to kingdom, second coming, 70th week, all of that stuff, and anoint the most holy to go into the kingdom. So you always have things that are old covenant, new covenant, and the divider in between, which is typically the cross. We also see these for the mystery of God, the 6 points of the mystery of God. You have God was manifest in the flesh. He was born, justified in the spirit. He was born in the spirit, but also the spirit rested upon him at his ministry, first day of his ministry. Manifest in the flesh, justified in the spirit. God was manifest in the flesh, justified in the spirit, seen of angels. Goodness. And that was the first thing that happened after his ministry began, was he was tempted in the wilderness of the devil, as just one example. So all of his ministry was under Old Covenant. So you have 3 of 6 purposes under Old Covenant, and then you have the end of his ministry and the cross, right? Okay. So purpose 6 is preached unto the Gentiles. That happened after the cross. The Great Commission given to the 11, because Judas had hung himself, so there were only 11 apostles at that time. Was it Matthew was brought in later in Acts 1 to make 12 again. But preached unto the Gentiles was the first commission that was given after the resurrection. Believed on in the world and received up into glory. And that was his ascension. So you have 3 of 6 purposes under Old Covenant, 3 of 6 purposes under New, and the cross in between. The feasts are identical to that. You have 3 under Old Covenant, 3 under New Covenant, and the cross as the 7th and the pivot point between the 2. Old and New Covenants, I mean. So this is a pattern that is long established by God. You can see it in the 6 purposes for the 70 weeks. You can see it in the 6 points of the mystery of God, and you can see it in the 7 feasts. Jesus was born under the law to redeem people from the curse of the law. He was a man. God became a man for the express purpose of fulfilling the redemptive story. So the first thing is not what he did, it is who he is. It's being versus doing. Jesus became a man. Tabernacles, day 1. So why the first day of the feast is a solemn assembly, and the 8th day of the feast is also a solemn assembly called the 8th day assembly, which pointed to the circumcision of Christ. The next feast that was fulfilled under Old Covenant was day 1 of his ministry, which was the Day of Atonement, where he assumed the role of the scapegoat, which is entirely related to the Day of Atonement, and as a result, preached Jubilee, which is liberty via the forgiveness of sin. The role of the scapegoat was to have the sin of Israel laid upon his head. Jesus, we are told, he became sin who knew no sin, that we might be the righteousness of God through him. So he had to die. He did choose to die for sin, but he had no sin of his own, so he had to assume or have laid upon him the sin of everyone else so that he could take it away. So he became the scapegoat, the innocent animal in Leviticus 16. The innocent scapegoat had the sins of Israel laid upon its head, and then it was sent alive away from the camp, signaling that sins had been taken away or sent away from Israel. And that was an annual remembrance. So Jesus became the scapegoat on the Day of Atonement. And that is why the Spirit of rested upon him. And the voice from heaven said, "This is my Son in whom I am well pleased." And also why Jesus told John, "It becometh us to fulfill all righteousness," because he had to become the scapegoat. And in Luke 4, in explaining this, he said, "The Spirit is upon me," the same Spirit that descended upon him and abode upon him like a dove on the Day of Atonement. "The Spirit hath anointed me to preach Jubilee, to preach good tidings unto the meek. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance unto the captive, the opening of the prison to them that are bound, to preach the acceptable year of the Lord." So on Tabernacles, he became a man, is a man. Jesus is a man, fully God, but also fully man. And on Atonement, he became the scapegoat. Jesus is the scapegoat. And then Jesus is the trump. Jesus is the voice of God on earth. The Feast of Trumpets was written into the law as a memorial, the blowing of trumpets. Memorial to what? Well, day one of creation, which back then was Tishri 1. The head of the year was changed in Exodus 12 so that Nisan or Abib became the head of the year, and Tishri became month 7, which is why the feast is now celebrated, or was celebrated then, written into the law, not now, but was celebrated then on Tishri 1, because that was day one of creation. Was day 1, month 1 in Genesis 1, became day 1, month 7 in Exodus 12. But it was always backward looking to day 1 of creation, where the Word began to speak the worlds into existence. And so it was the voice of God on earth that the Feast of Trumpets was forward looking to. Jesus is the voice of God. So you have Jesus is the man, Jesus is the scapegoat, Jesus is the voice of God. And then you have, those were the three under the Old Covenant, because the ministry of Christ was entirely under Old Covenant, forward looking to the time when he would present the kingdom to Israel. They rejected it. And it was only after that, after the end of his ministry, 4 days later to be precise, that he went to the cross to become the Passover. Hence your pivot point between Old and New Covenants. He shut up the old with his death on the cross and instituted the new immediately with that same death and shed blood on the cross. So you have 3 under Old, and then Passover is your pivot point. The cross is always the pivot point. And then unleavened bread, Jesus was the sinless bread of life, sent down from heaven, and anyone who eats of him, who partakes of him, will have eternal life. Jesus is the first fruits of the dead, Resurrection Sunday. And Jesus is the bridegroom, which is why the Spirit was sent on Pentecost, because the Spirit is the gifts portion of the marriage covenant between Christ and the church. It is the gifts portion of the new covenant, which is the marriage covenant between Christ and the church. So yes, we can say, well, he did a thing. He sent the Comforter. It's not a being versus doing, because on Pentecost he sent the Comforter. But why did he do that? Because he is the bridegroom, and the responsibility of the bridegroom is to give gifts to his intended, to his betrothed. So 100% of the feasts were about the being of Christ, were about the person of Christ. Jesus is a man. Jesus is the scapegoat who bore the sins, but he is the scapegoat. He is the voice of God. He is the Passover. He is the sinless bread of life. He is the first fruits of the dead, and he is the bridegroom. Those are what the 7 feasts represent, the person of Christ. And so when people misconstrue that into activities that he's going to do, and they take away from his person in order to do that, and involve us in his redemptive story, it belies so much misunderstanding. The redemptive story belongs solely and completely to Jesus Christ. The law pointed to the person of Jesus Christ and to the redemptive story, so that, based on what people observed of him through his person, they could identify their Messiah. We diminish the person of Christ when we try to link things to us that have no business being linked to us. Yes, Jesus is going to come take his bride home. There is going to be a rapture. It's going to be pre-trib. But it's not going to have anything to do with the Feast of Trumpets, because the Feast of Trumpets was all about celebrating Jesus, who spoke the worlds into existence, and forward-looking to the incarnation of the voice of God on earth. It has nothing to do with the church. And I feel like every time we try to insert ourselves in a conversation that is solely and exclusively about him, we diminish him to exalt self. And I don't believe that there is malicious intent behind that. I think truly people are just looking for signs or dates. I hope it's as simple as that and less malicious, but regardless of intent, the outcome is the same. You are taking away from the redemptive story that belongs solely to Jesus Christ and trying to insert yourself in a conversation you have no business inserting yourself in. The Feast of Trumpets, as I said, was solely and specifically related to the celebration of the incarnation of the Creator God, who is also your Redeemer. That is it. He had a ministry during which he sounded the trumpet. It has nothing to do with the rapture of the church. There is similar language used because the trump is associated with the voice of God, and said voice of God will be used to call us home. That's why it says, the Lord himself shall descend from heaven with a shout, used to wake the dead, the voice of the archangel, which is the voice of the ruler over the angels and not as an angel himself, and with the trump of God, the voice of God used to call to assembly. 1 Corinthians 15 calls it the last trump. Behold, I show you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trump. That is the last time the voice of Jesus will be used in the present dispensation, because the voice of Jesus was already used in the present dispensation to give the Great Commission, to give lots of different words in the 40 days between the time he rose and he ascended. Gave lots of words. So the voice of Jesus has already been sounded in the present dispensation. The rapture of the church will be the last time the voice of Jesus is used in the present dispensation, and it will be to call us home. But that should not be misconstrued with the meaning of the Feast of Trumpets, because that was related to the ministry of Christ under Old Covenant to Israel, which was why it was written into the law for Israel, so that they could recognize their Messiah by his person, the incarnated Creator sounding the trumpet. The Day of Atonement was related to Jesus becoming the scapegoat and agreeing to bear the sin of Israel in their place. It has no bearing on the second coming or on Armageddon or any such thing. It does have bearing on the midpoint of the 70th week, not ironically that if and since the beginning of the 70th week will be Nisan 10, the midpoint would be Tishri 10, Israel's most solemn holy day, and on that most solemn holy day, they will be required to either break their law and live by fleeing, or keep their law and physically die by staying behind, or spiritually dying, because then they might fall prey to worshiping the beast's image or receiving his mark. So that is the only thing related to, and it's totally ironic that the midpoint of the 70th week would fall on that day, because there is massive spiritual and physical implication for Israel in choosing to reject or keep their law, because one will save and the other will kill. So there's massive implication with that. But it has nothing to do with the rapture or the second coming of Christ or Armageddon or anything like that. And certainly tabernacles will be us tabernacling with God in the kingdom, yes. And there will be an annual feast that everyone inside and outside of Israel will be required to celebrate, because that was the incarnation of the Creator God. It's a celebration of Jesus' birth. And we will be in the kingdom with him, living physically with him, tabernacling with him. But that does not mean that the kingdom starts on the Feast of Tabernacles. Only that during every calendar year, there will be an annual requirement to go to Jerusalem annually to worship the King and to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. But it has nothing to do with the beginning or ending of that time period, only that it will occur every year during. So we've read into these things based on activity rather than personhood and being. And maybe I'm beating a dead horse, and maybe I'm preaching to the choir or telling people things they don't care. But this is a distinction, a differentiation that makes significant, hopefully, it makes significantly more clear why these things don't pertain, why they were never intended to pertain, and why people who are involved in this fall feasts nonsense are really just perpetuating falsehood. And I don't think it's malicious. I think that it's, at its core, I think these people just want some kind of a sign or some kind of a date to hang their hat on, but it's aimed in the wrong spot. I do feel like it's my obligation to try to talk some sense into these people. Maybe they'll hear it, maybe they won't. But at least I will have tried.